Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 15 Entombed. David sat on the bed in room 202, with his ear against the wall, listening intently to the room next door, where their escort and spy, Fempiror, slept like a baby. Beth reclined on her side with her head propped on one elbow, watching him. He turned and smiled at Beth, now satisfied that they could speak freely for a moment. Whoever Fempiror was, he did not seem very interested in actually spying on them. "He's asleep," David told her in a whisper. "How can you tell?" Beth asked. "He snores," David said, loudly. Beth chuckled and shook her head. David lay down next to Beth, who cuddled up to him. He put his arm around her and held her close. 10 years of regret melted away as they finally shared some measure of the life they had once desired. Even though they had gone through so much since Hoggenstown, their hearts had hardly changed. "So," David began, turning to the other reason they had come to Calirum, "who do you think they had behind that window?" "I'm sure the one we saw was the same person I saw when I took a sample of their newest poison in Aram," Beth answered directly. "He was a recipient of it, and was unconscious at that time. I guess they transported him here after that. I don't know about the other one." David nodded. "So, the Tepish are involved." "Apparently," Beth agreed. "What do you think they want with this town?" "I would guess either an out-of-the-way test area," David suggested, "or a fair supply of victims." "The Tepish don't just leave people in peace," Beth pointed out. "There are regular humans here. Maybe we should try to get them out." David shook his head. "We should advise our chain of command what we've discovered, and they'll let us know what to do next," he said. "Tonight, we meet whoever is in charge of Obadiah." "We can't trust him," Beth noted. "Of course not," David agreed. "But as long as we continue in our naivety, we'll be fine until we report. I think we may have all the information we need, but I'd like to know what the Tepish want with these people." "Agreed," Beth said. There lay the one unanswered question, or they would just leave at sunset. The Tepish had chosen Calirum for an unknown reason, and they needed to try to find out what that reason was. Could it be as simple as being far away from Aram, or did this town possess something the Tepish wanted? And then there was the question of this other Fempiror in charge. David was certain this person was a Tepish, and while David knew that there was a chance that either Vladimir or the El Rod Malnak, Korean, might remember him, there was very little chance this Tepish so far from Aram would be either of them. He needed to be ready for anything, but the chances of this other Fempiror knowing him or Beth was so remote, it was not worth considering. Beth turned and wrapped her arm around David's chest, snapping him from his thought. He pulled her closer and clasped his hands around her in a tight embrace. It had been a very long and eventful day. He was astounded that when they woke up at the beginning of the evening, they were still at odds with each other, and now they were deeply in love again. Holding her close to him, he felt complete. For the first time since this life had ripped him from Hoggenstown, David felt like everything was going to be all right. Vladimir strolled along the path taken by the mutations he had unleashed on the unsuspecting Rostem who dared to make their way through Aram during the day. He suspected that once they had found their fallen comrade, they would move as soon as possible. He was so certain of it that he had only posted a few guards near their outpost to make sure they actually left, and Tiberius being Tiberius, they did exactly as predicted. He had given those Tepish strict orders not to attack, but to allow them to leave their hole and begin whatever trek they had planned. The Tepish had long been aware that the Rostem tended to change locations during the day, because the Rostem correctly surmised that the Tepish would be largely unwilling to risk any of their dwindling forces on a day assault. On this day, the Rostem had inflicted some heavy casualties, but as evidenced by the carnage on the path he and his contingency of Tepish, all protected by day travel cloaks, followed through Aram, the Rostem had not anticipated their newest weapon. The dead Rostem led him to the large, ancient church that dominated the southwestern quarter of Aram. The shattered window and a mutation feasting on a nearby corpse told more of the story of Rostem defeat. He heard mutterings from the Tepish behind him, and he knew they were unprepared for this sight. It mattered little to him, though. These mutations were behaving exactly as he had hoped. The mutation glanced up briefly at the passing Tepish line, but he only cared for his meal and did not bother them. He heard a shout of "Come on!" echo out of the side of the building, telling him that within this blessed structure, the battle continued. Vladimir knew it must have been a dire situation indeed for the Rostim to consider a fight inside the church, for Tiberius had always held this place as so sacred that the Rostim never used it and its labyrinthine catacombs for an outpost. He calmly led his group to the doors of the church. He found them locked, so he gave a solid rap on the doors. After a long moment, a low scraping sounded from the other side as someone removed the large bolt and tossed it to the floor. The doors whisked open, and the mutation looked at them for only a moment before baring its teeth and crouching for an attack. The Tepish squads shrank back in surprise. "Hold it," Vladimir ordered. The mutation paused and stared at him quizzically. Vladimir had won them over as a friend before turning them loose earlier, and the mutation apparently remembered him. Or so he hoped. "Remain here," he said to the creature. Vladimir gestured to his squad and they followed him into the church, each one carefully avoiding any level of contact with the mutation, who only watched them pass with a confused look. Vladimir glanced around the room and saw 2 more dead Rostim, along with one of the mutations, but no more than that. Given that the Rostim outnumbered the mutations prior to the battle, he was satisfied that the Rostim had only killed 1. He led the squad between the pews through the expansive sanctuary hall, and then through the door at the front of the sanctuary. There he found the 9 other mutations looking down a carved tunnel that led into the catacombs beneath the church. He paused for a moment, wondering why they had not followed their prey down the tunnel. So far they had been mindless beasts with very limited cognizance of their surroundings, and yet the only problem he could find with the tunnel was a lack of light. Surely they are not afraid of the dark, he thought. He walked up behind them. "Excellent work, my friends," Vladimir said, startling them. They hissed and jumped out of the way, some of them even landing on the walls and sticking there. Vladimir found this to be a strange reaction, but they had always behaved a bit mindlessly, so it did not concern him. He gazed in surprise at the mutations who crouched on all fours on the walls. Whatever his young friend had done to the serum, the effects continued to surprise him. He had no idea they could cling to the walls, and found this ability both useful and disconcerting. After a moment, he found his voice again. "We can take it from here," he told them. Collectively, they crawled away from the Tepish and backed into a corner of the room. There, they just watched. Vladimir turned to the damp entrance to the catacombs and wondered again why the mutations had stopped. He had planned to follow the mutations just in case the Rostim went underground, and the fact that the mutations did stop allowed his troops to move that much more freely. His one concern was the mutations mistaking his squad in the catacombs for the Rostim and attacking them as well, and now their reluctance to enter the tunnels alleviated that issue. He pulled out his self-lighting torch and fired it up. He longed for the days when they carried lanterns powered by churning pools, but Koreans' rash takeover of Aram and irresponsible rules drove out anyone who specialized in these things, which left them with their primitive beginnings. Looking again down into the pitch black of the catacombs, he felt it was all too probable that since the mutations had no light source, they were unwilling to head into the darkness. As easy as it was to get lost down there, he could not blame them. The darkness was another reason that Vladimir brought some Tepish along to finish the job, just in case. He turned to his Tepish. "Somewhere in this maze are our enemies," Vladimir said. "They have subverted us for long enough. Spread out and find them. When you find them, kill them. No questions, no prisoners." Several Tepish drew self-lighting torches and lit them as others drew their swords. Vladimir stood aside, and the Tepish charged recklessly into the depths of the catacombs. Tiberius followed Yori as she led the 6 remaining Rostim at a brisk walk through the maze of coffin-riddled catacombs under the old church in Aram. Behind Tiberius was Kaltesh, followed by Tirin, Boltash, and finally Falta. At their pace, the flame on the self-lighting torch she held ahead of her trailed well behind its source, only barely remaining lit. Its light flickered off the dirt and stone walls, along with the wooden supports they periodically passed that prevented the tunnels from collapsing. The tunnels were just wide enough for one person, so they were forced to walk single file. Because the people of Aram had used these tunnels for centuries as tombs, thin wooden coffins lined nearly every inch of space on the wall. The holes for the coffins were carved out of the wall, one at floor level and another at waist level. The opposite walls were usually carved at the same points, so that they passed 4 coffins at a time, 2 on each side. The tunnel opened up at regular intervals to a circular room where new tunnels would branch out, and there would be pairs of coffins in the same stacked holes between each tunnel of the 4-way branch. It was nothing short of a nightmare to navigate, and a wonder it did not intersect with the sewer system. "Yori, do you know where this will lead us?" Tiberius asked desperately. Yori let out a brief chuckle. "Tiberius," she said with more than a touch of forgivable irritation in her voice, "I don't even know if there's a way out. We heard the fighting and ran back without searching much of it." "How are your instincts?" he asked. "Perfect as ever," she said, turning briefly to him. "If there's an exit, I'll find it." She turned back to the front, and Tiberius heard her mutter, "Hopefully." "On the bright side," Tyrion pointed out from behind him, "the maze of this place will at least slow down our pursuers. There hasn't been a sound of them since we got down here." "Doesn't mean much," Boltosh said. "We didn't hear them earlier, just saw them." "You know," Kaltesh said, "we're not going to have much of a chance if they corner us." Tiberius did not admire the pessimistic outlook, but he could do nothing about it. He shrugged. "Well, we can at least give them something to talk about," he said, "if those creatures talk at all. Regardless, if we go down fighting." "Comforting thought," Fulton mumbled, clearly unhappy with the idea that she might die among the corpses down here. The path quickly started to look the same as they passed the sets of coffins on either side of the walkway, followed by the round junctions containing 8 caskets. Yori took turns seemingly at random, but Tiberius could at least tell, based on the patterns of crumbling dirt and decay of the coffins, that they were not going in circles. Tiberius wished they had another torch to light the rear of their line, but the combination of Tepish and Mutation attacks had killed the other Rostim who carried their torches. "Boltosh, do you hear that?" Tiberius overheard Faltus saying from the back of the line. He stopped and turned to the darkness behind him. Yori walked to stand behind Tiberius, illuminating his back with the torch. "That sounds like more than 10, Boltosh said. Tiberius listened carefully to the sounds of the tunnels around them. There was a low rumble from behind them. Definitely more than 10. The sounds grew louder and sounded from all around them. Their pursuers were not only following them, they were filling the catacombs. "Those aren't their new Fempiror," Tiberius said. "They've set their Tepish warriors on us. We need to find a place to hide." Tiberius looked to Yori, who shrugged. "These catacombs are as unfamiliar to me as everyone else," she said apologetically. "I have tried to keep us going upward, or at least level, but I don't know if we're getting anywhere. I know I can get us out. I just don't know when that will happen." "It's all right, Yori," Tiberius said. He looked around. They were in a junction room containing 8 coffins and 4 ways out. Tiberius saw only one unpleasant solution to their problem. "Listen, everyone," he began. "We're going to have to crawl into the crypts. It will not be fun, but I'll spend the day with a stiff if I could wake up tomorrow. Yori, give me the light." He held out his hand, and Yori handed him the torch. "You 5 get in," Tiberius continued. "I'll go last. Cover your faces with your cloaks or you'll choke on the dust. Do not get out until I give the signal. You'd better get comfortable. I'm not going to get us out until I'm satisfied they've gone, and I have a feeling that could be a while." The other 5 Rostim walked to 5 of the rotted wooden coffins in the room, and reluctantly opened the lids. At once, they grimaced at the remains inside, but they were at an impasse. While no one looked forward to what they had to do, no one complained as they climbed into their coffins and closed the lids. The thunder of the footfalls continued to grow louder around him as Tiberius turned to his own coffin. Tiberius took one last breath of fresher air than he would have for some time to come. He opened the coffin and looked upon the decayed remains of someone who had been there for over 100 years. He knew when he climbed in that his body would crush the remains into dust, but he also did not want to join this corpse forever down here. He doused the light, climbed in, and closed the lid over him. He immediately regretted his decision. The darkness was stifling, but the smell was worse. He held back coughing as well as he could while the dust in the coffin surrounded him, as if the spirit of the person whose space he invaded was unhappy about being disturbed by the living. The footfalls grew louder until a small army of Tepish charged by their position. Then the thunder rolled away like a summer storm further and further down the tunnels until the darkness and dust was joined by complete silence.